shall never surrender.
And tonight, our very special guest, Jonathan Gray, and we're going to be talking about ancient archaeology. Just what did they do? What did they know that somehow got lost over the ages? Jonathan Gray knows, and we'll be back with him in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Jonathan Gray, international explorer, archaeologist, author. He has traveled the world to gather data on ancient mysteries, and over the past 37 years, he has penetrated some largely unexplored areas. In the course of his explorations, Jonathan began to uncover evidence of very surprising out-of-place artifacts. According to what he was taught at school, this was impossible. There simply could not have any. They couldn't exist. These were not just isolated anomalies. There was also a global pattern to them, suggesting an ancient worldwide civilization of astonishing proportions. Here he is, back on Coast to Coast, Jonathan Gray. Jonathan, how are you?
Very well, thank you, George, and it's always good to hear your very vibrant voice.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. I'm fighting a cold, but it's still holding on. That's the important thing.
I'm sure you'll win.
Have you traveled since we last talked in June of last year?
Well, yes, I have travelled, but not so much doing archaeological work as lecturing, George. I do quite a deal of that.
Well, good for you. You know, your one work, Dead Man's Secrets, that came out when, around 2004?
Yes, that's about right.
And how about the other one, Weapon of the Globalist Sphere?
That's a new one.
Okay, that's just hitting the shelves now. And that one I want to talk with you about a lot tonight, Jonathan, because you've uncovered a lot. Now, let's talk a little bit about you, first of all, beyond the bio. Tell us who Jonathan Gray is.
Well, Jonathan Gray is an archaeologist, been involved in frontline archaeology. I've led or accompanied about 25 important expeditions in South America, the Middle East, and Asia. I've also published just over 50 books, and I have an internet newsletter which goes out once a week around the world.
What got you interested in ancient archaeology?
About 10 years old I was, George, and I picked up a magazine in Australia which spoke of the British explorer who... his name was Percy Fawcett. He was actually a surveyor for the British government, and he was surveying the borders of many of the South American countries, which led him into the Amazon jungle. And there he said he came across a dead city, vine-choked, huge walled city, and it was just guarded by little fellows with blowpipes and poison darts. And he went back to Britain, and he tried to get some help, but they wouldn't believe him, so he went back with his son, and he disappeared in the jungle. And I thought, my, what an adventure. That's going to be my first expedition, and it turned out to be I did go to the Amazon first.
Yeah, I mean, this is all fascinating. Your work is just absolutely stunning. And, I really think there's a lot of credence to it. You know, did mainstream science, are they starting to look at this saying, you know what, he could be right?
Yes, under the board, under the table, many of them are admitting that there's a lot of sense in this.
What kind of evidence did you have to uncover in order to convince yourself that things happened on this planet a long, long time ago?
Well, George, I guess one of the first things I saw in the Amazon was Egyptian hieroglyphics on metal plates in the hands of natives that couldn't read or write. And they said that their ancestors used to trade down the river to great ships that came in across the Eastern Sea. That perked my interest, but not enough yet. I was writing a history book, and it was going to follow the traditional route, of course. But in the course of this, over 30 countries, I began to dig up information that just didn't fit. And there wasn't just one or two, and you mentioned this, but there just wasn't one or two. It started becoming an avalanche. And then I saw a pattern globally, and the pattern is what fascinated me. There had to be a worldwide use of all these unusual things that we thought we are the first to invent.
You've done some work about what some people have said about the past, and you quote an atheist. Tell me about that.
Yes. Perhaps the world's best-known atheist is a gentleman in England, Mr. Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins, yes. Yep. And he made a statement recently. He actually came to Australia, and he four times he made this statement. He said, "I challenge anyone to submit out-of-sequence fossil finds that disprove evolution." And then, as soon as he left, in New Zealand Investigate magazine, his disciple Warwick Don went a little further and he said, "Evolution would be falsified if even one out-of-sequence fossil were ever found in the fossil record. For example, a fossil human in the Carboniferous. No such anachronistic fossils have ever been found," and that was the agreement of both these gentlemen.
Huh. Well, let me tell you, if anything like that could have been found, then what do you do?
Oh, my. Well, out of your own mouth, you say it's falsified.
Yeah, you'd have to think that.
Yeah.
These ancients, how far back are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about the earliest, and then I'm going to say here that I'm not endorsing, though we can get into this later on, I'm not endorsing the year count of the evolutionary geological column, but I am saying this, that what they say is the earliest, that's the Precambrian, does contain human fossils as well.
And what would that give us as a year?
Oh, about 600 to 700 million years.
Jeez. And this...
on the evolutionary counting dating.
And could we tell if there was any intelligence at that time?
Well, the appearance of the remains is, well, let me tell you this. Does a silver vase manufacture itself, or would it have to be manufactured by an intelligent human being?
Exactly. And if they manufactured it, they must have had tools to do it with.
Absolutely, and they were able to inlay silver into the grooves that they created. So this was really sophisticated.
When I was a young boy, Jonathan, I used to think that this planet might have had civilizations hundreds of millions of years ago that just got covered up over the eons. And, maybe they're buried 1 or 2 miles deep. I don't know. But I used to think that as a kid. Was I way off, or is that possible?
No, you were thinking right, George. And however you sense that, your intuition is now being exonerated. Yes, in fact, let me put it this way. Over in Pennsylvania, coal miners digging down at very low levels, about, say, 2 miles below the surface of the ground, doing a horizontal drive. In mines, like they call the drives are the horizontal cuttings underground. They came flat bang against a dressed stone wall, man-made wall. 3 kilometres, 2 miles under the ground. Now, when they reported that drive was closed by the mining company under pressure from someone else.
And there's no way shifting plates could bring a city like that down there, or a structure.
Oh, no, it would have been smashed to pieces.
Would calamities cover it?
Yes, and I do believe that we're looking at calamity here, not a slow evolutionary build-up of ground around it and just slowly building up for 3 miles in depth, 2 miles in depth. What we're looking at here is catastrophe, because we find much evidence right through all the layers of our planet, through all those so-called geological columns. Everywhere you go, there's evidence of catastrophic burial, where things that could otherwise decay or be eaten by predators are found preserved with a colour on them, the food and sometimes in their stomachs or intestines, and these had to be buried quickly before decay set in.
Could these ancient civilizations have possessed the kind of technology we have now? Could they have had cities with skyscrapers and buildings like we have now?
We have reports from ancient records that they did. And we certainly have sophistication enough being dug up to show that was possible.
Then in my mind, something happened, and then there was a period of time, could have been millions and millions of years, where civilization was probably extinct, and then it came back again. Is that possible?
It sounds very plausible, George, but I think I can produce evidence tonight, if we have got time to do so, that shows there was one enormous catastrophe on a world scale, and I can prove that it was on a world scale, and not just the whole series of isolated small catastrophes added up together, but one amazingly big catastrophe globally, and that in all the layers laid down, these layers intermingle to the extent that you know that it was the one event, if you know what I mean.
Okay, and when might that have happened?
Well, I'm going to produce. I'm going to suggest now something quite revolutionary, and I know this is going to make people's, I'm going to suggest that we know the date. It can be proved scientifically, and that all ancient civilizations knew the date and left a record of it.
All right, we will squeeze that date out of you by the end of the show. We will. I mean, I find this fascinating. I mean, because it tells me who we are, what we might be, where we're going, where we may be going again. Do you think they possessed the ability? Of course, if you look at some of the writings from India, there were flying machines, Vimanas. Do you think they went to the moon? They went to Mars? Did they?
Oh, yes, I'm absolutely convinced that they did.
Oh.
I'll just give you one example. The Chinese, of course, are not known for their fiction. An emperor way back early in history set the scale on this. He said, anyone who writes fiction, we're putting into law the fact that they will lose their head. We only want fact to be passed down to our children. Now, as we go into the Chinese writings of about the 3rd century BC, we have a lot of writings preserved for us, which are now translated into English, stating that travel to the moon was a common occurrence, at least to the Chinese.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes.
I've always wondered whether our astronauts actually saw artifacts on the moon.
Well,
ancient
that's
ones.
I like that question, because I'll tell you what, I was walking up Hay Street, Perth, Western Australia, the day when Armstrong walked on the moon, and I'm not sure who was it. Was it Bud Aldridge or someone?
Buzz Aldrin was his number 2 guy.
Aldrin, right. He was orbiting, wasn't he?
No. That was Michael Collins.
Oh, Michael Collins was orbiting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Buzz was on the moon with him.
Okay, you're right.
And if you tell him he wasn't, he'll punch you.
I'll keep away from.
Yeah.
No, I won't. I agree with you. Now, what happened here was I heard a broadcast which millions of people all over the world did hear. It was live from the orbiting spacecraft where Collins was reporting what he was observing from above.
Okay.
Now, before I speak of that, let's go for now. He said down there, he said, looks like there's a human, a man-made building. Look, this is artificial. And he went on for about 11 minutes describing this artificial construction that he was certain was not natural. Now, on subsequent broadcasts, that 11 minutes, only those 11 minutes were deleted.
Of course. They don't want us to hear that.
Oh, no. Let's get back now to the Chinese records, where they state that when they went to the moon, it was cold. There was no air, very little air. The sky looked black. You were bouncy on the moon. The surface of the moon looked a little glassy in the light. Now, this is exactly what all our astronauts have told us.
I know that.
Yeah.
And this was how far back? Thousands of years?
Yes, 2,300 years ago.
Oh, my.
And something else, they said that they constructed a building which they called the Palace of Cold, C-O-L-D, because of the temperature.
And it's probably still there.
Probably still there. And my imagination runs riot sometimes, George, and maybe this is not exactly what Collins saw, but could he have actually seen that structure? Or are there other structures as well?
There have been reports that there are glass structures on the moon. I mean, we've had a number of guests on who've talked about this. As far-fetched as it seems, if civilizations were indeed that old, Michael Cremo would agree with you, that mankind is hundreds of millions of years old, it's very possible they possess that kind of technology. I think knowledge works at a certain rate. And eventually, if you have a civilization that's hundreds of millions of years old, they're going to get technology. It's going to happen.
Well, we're intelligent, and I hope we all are. I believe that we're talking to an intelligent audience.
Oh, we
George,
are.
I know you are anyway.
They're smarter than me, Jonathan.
And I'm doing my best. We come from ancestors who have given us the DNA that they possessed, right? And according to the laws of genetics, DNA does not, information does not get added. Information actually gets lost. So we're no more intelligent than our ancestors. If anything, we're a little less, but we're still pretty good.
As an archaeologist, how do you start a project? Are you looking at maps? Do you go out and buy tools? I mean, I always remember one of my favorite old movies, Journey to the Center of the Earth. And James Mason, they go out and they get their little tools and their hammers and things. How do you plan an archaeological trip?
Well, I guess, first of all, you're interested in a subject. You would wish you could find the remains of an old event or something like that, or something you've read about.
Are you looking for the event, or do you stumble into it?
Sometimes you stumble into something you don't expect.
Okay.
But more often than not, you have a general idea of what you're looking for. You're saying, okay, there was a Greek city. I'd love to find it. I'm going to go look for all the clues of it. I'm going to go to old maps, for example, old place names on the maps that have remained unchanged for thousands of years, because a place name often tells a story. And in the United States, there must be thousands of place names that tell a story from the old pioneer days, for example. And a story that's occurred at a certain place will often leave its mark in a place name. And you compare those with modern maps, and if the names are the same, you say, okay, there's a fair chance if I go to this area, I'll start finding evidence of that event. That's one way archaeologists work.
How come we can't find Atlantis, or have we, and they're just not telling us?
I believe we have enough evidence to help us with that, George. No one can be certain, but there are good clues that we could sort of pick up, and I do think that where those clues can be followed, we can get a pretty fair idea of where Atlantis was. Is
the demise of Atlantis part of this calamity that we're going to talk about tonight?
There's two theories about that. One, that the whole globe, global destruction actually was the destruction of what today we might call Atlantis, because there are many similarities to that world and the Atlantis legend.
Right.
The other one is that it was a smaller place in the Mediterranean, not in the Atlantic rather, but in the Mediterranean, and that all of the dates, say 9,000 years earlier, Solon actually was the man who gave the story, and the story comes to us fourth hand before it was written down. So it's impossible to be certain as to the authenticity of the legend or the precise time of the destruction, but there are reasonable grounds to place the event, assuming it occurred, not 9,000 years earlier, but 900 years before it was told.
Oh, right.
There are two words in the Egyptian language which are very similar, one for 1,000 and one for 100, and that could have occurred.
Right.
And if this is so, then where we have a figure of, say, 100,000, that would be 10,000, and so on, all the way through the story.
What would have caused a landmass or a continent to sink? Probably quickly.
Earthquake or readjustment going on for hundreds of years after a global disaster, readjustment of the crust.
And then bang.
Yeah.
Down it goes. What about an asteroid?
Asteroid could cause havoc, but it wouldn't cause the land to sink or rise.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, Jonathan, I want to talk more with you. We're talking with Jonathan Gray, author of The Weapon, The Globalist's Fear, and also Dead Man's Secrets, his website, beforeus.com. This is absolutely riveting. How about a 400-foot tall pyramid on the bottom of the ocean? How did that get there? We're going to talk about that and some other issues that he has investigated as an ancient archaeologist right here on Coast to Coast AM. Jonathan Gray, our special guest, and please go see his website. You get a very good idea of some of the topics at hand tonight on Coast to Coast AM. We'll be right back with him. Don't touch your dial. And welcome back. We're with Jonathan Gray. Jonathan, the title of your book, The Weapon, The Globalist's Fear, what does that mean?
the fact is that there is evidence which the people who are planning the New World Order don't want us to know about, and the book reveals that.
Interesting. All right. We'll get into a little bit of that, too. Now, you make a radical suggestion that around 2300 BC, all natural processes worldwide come to an abrupt halt. Then they restart again. What happened?
Yes. This is the time of the great disaster we're talking about, and I can pinpoint it to the year 2345 BC. Not myself only, but scientists who have investigated this carefully have all come not just to the fact that it occurred so recently, but that it occurred that very year, and quite from independent evidence that each one digs up. So here is something that we haven't talked about yet. The world as a whole doesn't know about this yet, but it's going to overthrow everything we've been taught about our ancient history.
Fascinating. Okay, kind of paint us a picture. What does the planet look like at around this time period, before the event occurs?
Before the event, we talk about continental drift. Now, that's a myth. It was a continental split. The Great Disaster cracked the continental mass, which was a one-world continent, which was a climate pretty well much like a spring-like loveliness from pole to pole. Now, all geologists will agree that the Earth at some stage had that climate. Well, I'm suggesting that before this great disaster, that's what the climate was. And not only from science, but from records in ancient races as well, from the Mexicans right across to the Chinese and the Egyptians. Now, at this time, the Earth was tilted on its axis violently, very suddenly, and the stresses that this generated in the surface of the Earth caused a quick breakup. A crack would have appeared, which would have travelled around the world at about 8 miles a second.
Oh.
And in just a few hours, there would have been tremendous volcanism bursting out of the subterranean basins. We estimate about 30,000 volcanoes.
How deep do you think all this was?
Well, we have water-laid sediment. As we drill through now, it goes down at least 10 miles deep in many places.
Oh, my gosh.
60,000 feet deep. So this was an upheaval that churned up continent and seas together on an enormous scale.
The seas would just filter into it like they were going down a drain, wouldn't they?
Yes, but with the volcanoes, George, also, something like 80% of the gaseous material coming out of volcanoes is water.
Wow.
Enormous amount of water would be expelled from under the surface, plus the amazingly large underground water basins. There was, according to the climate we have, something like a terrarium, like you'd get in a terrarium today. That climate, pole to pole, would have been protected by a vapor canopy above the atmosphere. And there's good scientific evidence that such a canopy exists around some of the planets.
Now, this isn't what the Bible has talked about, the great flood of Noah, is it?
Well, it does speak of that. And you can name it the Great Flood of Noah, or you can simply call it the Great Deluge. Whichever you want, it's the same event.
It is the same event. Okay.
The same event, yeah.
So we might have had a survivor or two.
Yes, there was a handful of survivors. And interestingly enough, a number of races around the world trace themselves back to this very same period, to the same survivors. There's a tribe in China, Chinese. There are African tribes. There are the royal families of Ireland, of Norway, of Denmark, and Iceland, who have kept unbroken genealogical records going back to the same event, and they all have the same names for the flood surviving ancestors.
This sound of this cracking planet must have been immense. Can you imagine that?
Yes, it's hard to imagine. Imagine 30,000 thunders bursting out of the ground with fire and water.
Now, what, in terms of the inhabitants, prior to this episode, what did they look like? I mean, were there modern cities? Did they have, the amenities of life? Or were they just kind of Stone Age type people?
Oh, they had the amenities of life. We're digging down and we're finding the remains of the most sophisticated machinery, not actually machinery, or it could be parts of machinery, George, we're not sure. Either machinery or machine-made objects.
Give us some examples.
Well, a machine-made cube was found in a coal mine over in Austria some time ago. It was written up in a British scientific journal and a French scientific journal, and it ended up in a museum in Germany, and I believe it's still there. We have gold chains. We have iron pots. We have all sorts of everyday objects being found, thimbles, and they've got designs on them. We have parts of buildings under the ground in coal mines. We have the remains of people that have been found which appear to be very much like ourselves in appearance. And we have drawings of clothing, which is like our own modern clothing. I mean, fashions do change and go in cycles, as you can appreciate.
Yeah, they sure do. Wide ties, skinny ties are all coming back, aren't they?
Yes.
What kind of cataclysm could have done all this?
Well, this would have... let me give you a scientific discovery that has been made in relation to this. I think perhaps that we could look at the work of Dodwell, who was a scientist in Australia. He, in fact, was one of the most eminent Australian scientists known in the history of that country. And he was actually Astronomer Royal for the Royal Adelaide Observatory. And he studied the observations made over hundreds of years through history all over the world relating to the relationship of our planet to the rising and setting of the sun. And thousands of annotations have been made through history, and he compared them and drew a graph. And the graph showed that our Earth had been tipped on its axis to about 26.5 degrees from an upright axis originally, and that it had slowly been wobbling back like a top to the present 23.5 degrees. And Dodwell then calculated from his graph and curve just how long ago this would have taken place. And he actually didn't make a vague guess. He actually made a very firm calculation, which was checked and rechecked by other scientists who have written about it, by the way, and confirmed that his calculations were correct. And he came to the conclusion and published it that the Earth was violently tipped on its axis in the year 2345 BC.
Huh.
And a sudden displacement of the Earth's axis would cause the destruction of the entire surface of the planet. He was convinced that had occurred. And this sudden change in position would leave the Earth wobbling like a disturbed top. And indeed, the Earth is wobbling on its axis today.
That's true.
Now, George Dodwell, by the way, he served in the South Australian Observatory for 53 years. And his work gained worldwide recognition. In fact, he is commemorated by a plaque on the site of the old observatory in the West Terrace in Adelaide. That's how respected this man is. Now, what he called it was the secular variation of the obliquity of the ecliptic. Now, put simply, that's the measurement of the sun's shadow length by ancient astronomers from all the different continents.
Okay.
Now, Dodwell's research was confirmed by Dr. Rhodes W. Fairbridge of Columbia University and published in Science magazine, which is one of the highest regarded magazines on Earth among scientists. So the evidence shows a tipping of the axis in 2345 BC, followed by a measurable corrective wobble. And there's a clear pattern of recovery since that date that has not been disrupted to this day.
Are these kinds of events, Jonathan, cyclical? Do they happen time and time again?
That would have to be a theory, but there's no evidence for anything like that, George.
Well, that's good. That's good. Let me ask you a little bit about the Mayan culture, right? We've got a calendar that apparently ends around 2012. Their culture, we know, was around 3100 BC. So where's the gap here for them?
Well, actually, that's a very interesting question because if their calendar goes back to 3114 BC, we would say, okay, they've been interrupted, therefore there could not have been a cataclysm in 2345 BC. That'd be a conclusion we should...
Unless they somehow survived it.
Now, the reason for that date is simply that they started at the end of a cycle and then extrapolated back to a beginning of that cycle. And now, the Maya were very, very good astronomers, as you know. In fact, their measurements of the length of the year and the day are more accurate than ours were until we discovered it. Now, what they did was this. From studying the movements of the heavenly bodies, the Maya calculated that there would be a conjunction of the Sun, the ecliptic, and the Milky Way in the year 2012.
Right. Without instruments, or maybe they had them.
They had instruments, yeah.
Ah.
Now, a milestone like that would appropriately end a natural astronomical cycle of our solar system around the Milky Way. And from this, because they could calculate the speed at which we were moving as a solar system, they were very sophisticated. From this calculated future event of 2012, they then extrapolated back to the same event where it last occurred. And that would have been 25,000 years ago. But they broke that up into cycles. And the most recent cycle would have begun in 3114 BC. If we take the long term of our solar systems, I mean, the Sun moves around our Milky Way with its planets in a certain cycle, just like as we move around the Sun and the Earth is circled by the Moon. So our solar system would do a cycle in about 25,000 years, but that would be broken up into about 5 milestones, and the most recent one would take them back to 3114 BC.
So, but
that was the start of their calendar cycle, not because they were existing then, but because that's the solar system cycle.
Civilizations, animals, everything that's on the planet back then, wiped out.
Wiped out
generally. Yep.
In 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah.
And it's taken now about 40, well, I don't know, how many years? 4,000 plus years to get to where we are now then, right?
That has, yeah. Yes. And interestingly, George, it's not just the Maya. All the civilizations go back to that date. And I've got very, very copious evidence that they are all in agreement with each other, despite what theorists, speculate. There's evidence for this.
Where do the pyramids fit in, Jonathan? Because I think they were built more than 5,000 years ago, maybe 10,000 years ago, maybe way before that.
Well,
and they're still here.
That's a good question. Most certainly. They are very, very old. No question about that. So, shall we spend a little time on that?
Yeah, we've got some time.
The Sphinx and the pyramids have always interested me. In fact, every time I go to Egypt, I just have to go there. And they're one of the most wonderful buildings in the world, really.
Oh, I haven't seen it. My father was born in Cairo. I'd love to get out there.
Oh, so he was born in Cairo.
He was there. That's where he came out.
What a fortunate man. He would have had a lot of romantic history drilled into him.
Yeah, he left, though, when he was about 6, so he was too small to really remember anything.
Yeah, fine. Okay, now, there's evidence that the tubular entrance passage in the Great Pyramid pointed to the North Polar Star in the year 2144 BC. That's 200 years after I speak of the Great Disaster, right?
All right.
Roughly. And it pointed to the North Polar Star in 2144 BC at the same time that the pyramid apex pointed to Alcyone, the pivot of the solar system, as it was anciently called, the foundation star. Now, in this descending passage, there are 2 scored lines which point upwards at right angles from the pointing of the passage itself, which goes to the old North Polar Star. Now, these scored lines point upwards through the pyramid to the same star, Alcyone, in the constellation known as the Pleiades. So what we've got here is a double check on something where 2 things were being pointed to at the same time, one through the tubular entrance and one through the apex of the pyramid, to a definite date, 2144 BC. Now, the tradition from the Euphrates region seems to identify this foundation star in the Pleiades with a ceremony of laying the foundation for a building. And this was a practice in ancient times that when a building had its foundation laid, it was always orientated to Alcyone. So I'm asking this question: was the pointer to Alcyone as the foundation star fixed in stone to record the date of the foundation of the Great Pyramid? Strong possibility.
Maybe.
However, we have other things to consider on this. The Great Pyramid actually is so accurate in its measurements that it can measure out the fraction of the yearly cycle, our 365 and a quarter day cycle. And
there's still the argument, who made them?
Yeah, that's right. The Egyptians, by the way, say that others came into Egypt and did it in the reign of Cheops.
Technology, what did they have?
They had the ability to raise heavy weights with sound waves. We know this simply because we've got the agreement of ancient records in South America, in Asia, and in Egypt, all converging with the same answer. So they didn't think up a lovely story separately. There had to be some kind of truth to what they were writing. They said actually they had control over sound waves, that they could affect the atomic structure of an object so that it would not be held back by gravity.
So they had some kind of device that would resonate, and it vibrated to the point where the blocks just, had no weight, basically.
Yeah, that's right. Which would make what we find today quite easy. I mean, we've got over, for example, in Baalbek, great stones lifted 20 feet above the ground, and these stones weigh 2,000 tons. Not 200, not 20, not 2, but 2,000. And we don't have any lifting devices today that can do that.
What about the talk of Adam and Eve? Is this after this calamity, or were they before?
Before.
Okay. So
I'd just like to mention, George, if I may, that the 365-degree measurement of the yearly cycle in the Great Pyramid, which is encapsulated within the pyramid, defines a year length which did not exist before the Great Disaster. It was the 360-day year before the Great Disaster, and we have quite a lot of testimony of the ancients relating to that. So if the Great Pyramid was built to encapsulate a 365-degree year, that would suggest it was built after the disaster.
After the disaster. That's fascinating. But with sophistication.
But with sophistication, yes. A sophistication that was inherited by the survivors of the flood disaster and passed on to their descendants.
Jonathan, when we come back, I want to get your take on the Sumerians, that culture as well, what's going on in South America. I want to get your take on the pyramid that's on the ocean floor. How in the heck did that get there? And, just so many more. We'll be back in a moment with Jonathan Gray on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight, Jonathan Gray, his latest work, The Weapon the Globalists Fear. We'll find out a little bit later on what that weapon just might be. Jonathan, what can you tell us about the Sumerian culture?
The Sumerian culture is reputedly the earliest of all the cultures, but the evidence now shows that the Sumerians, the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Egyptians all started roughly around the same time from a common beginning. When Alexander the Great defeated the Persians in 331 BC, he journeyed to Babylon, which was a center of the Sumerian, the location of the Sumerian culture. And he and his scholars there studied very, very carefully the astronomical observations of these people, and they placed the founding of Sumeria at 2234 BC. Rather interesting.
It is. Ominous date, isn't it?
Yes, uncannily close to what we've been speaking of.
What did you think of the work of the late Zecharia Sitchin, where he claims visitors from another planet came here, to mine gold, genetically altered mankind, and that it was based on his interpretation of the Sumerian texts that they're there? Very
interesting question, yes. Very important one, actually. I approached Zecharia Sitchin on this because I quoted him in some of my books for a while. Mm-hmm. In fact, in Dead Men's Secrets, I think I quote him 2 or 3 times. And my sympathies were with him simply because he, like myself, had come across the conclusion that our ancestors were not dumb. They started off pretty well, in the Sumerian times, they started off pretty sophisticated.
Right.
On that score, I thought, well, here's a man after my own heart. But as people began to contact me further, they said, but what about this? What about this? And it began to disturb me. So I contacted Zecharia in March this last year while he was still alive. And I specifically asked him, can you please tell me where I can find the Sumerian documents that you speak of? And I spelled out the Anunnaki, I spelled out Nibiru, the whole story of this mining on Earth and so on. I said, where are the Sumerian documents that tell us this? Because I'm going to have to answer people that put their trust in what I've written about you. He wrote back and was not able to tell me. He says, it's in my books. Well, of course, I'd read all his books, and I knew there was no evidence in his books. It was just the story. So I went on a search and discovered that we now have translated into English all of the Sumerian documents that have ever been unearthed. And there are 2 universities in America that now have made those available. And I specifically zeroed in on those particular subjects and found that they're not even in the Sumerian documents. Nibiru was mentioned, but as a human being that was deified after his hero life, and that was all it was. The Anunnaki were human beings who were very elite in their community, but they were not outer space gods.
But advanced, nonetheless.
And Nibiru was the name given to heroes when they died. Sometimes they would, Nibiru and other names were given, but Nibiru became the name given to the planet Jupiter, which is always visible, because this particular hero in Sumerian history did acts which made them honour him, and they said, all right, when we look up at Jupiter in the sky, we'll always remember him. That's the closest Nibiru ever got to being a planet, was a deified human identified with a planet after his death.
Why does there seem to be resistance by mainstream science to some of these theories? I mean, big deal if we are hundreds of millions of years old. That would be exciting. Why do they fight this?
The geological column, George, destroys the theory of evolution. That's as simple as that, really. Let's look at it this way. We started out with the challenge by our friend Mr. Dawkins and his protege, Mr. Don. Mm-hmm. Now, I happened to come across a dear man over there in the United States, a real true-blooded American. His name was Ed Conrad. And Ed actually, over there in near his hometown, began digging around, and there in the open coal fields, between coal strata, he came across a human skull, a human finger, and I think it was about 2 or 3 dozen various human remains. Now, he went to the Smithsonian with this, and he had a real battle. In fact, it's been going on for about 20 years. His first petrified skull was found between these coal veins, and 2 teeth were found inside it. Now, the Smithsonian promised to analyze it for him, and they said that they would they'd do a proper scientific examination. And before he did this, actually, Ed had learned that bone contains very small Haversian canals, and their presence is conclusive evidence of bone. Even if the bone has petrified, the canals are petrified as well, because they're just the holes in going through it. They're an integral part of the cell structure of bone. And they're the passageways for the process. Now, the Smithsonian, contrary to their promise, did not examine the cell structure, or if they did, they accidentally clamped up on what they'd found.
Right.
Now, Ed continued to pressure them, and they promised to examine further. Well, he kept coming back, and they just ignored him. And he pressed them and he pressed them, and all he got was weak excuses. And so he began to worry and say, hey, what's going on here? So had they discovered something that might blow their evolution theory sky high? Well, he continued to find more and more objects. And he took one of them, a photo of one of them actually, was forwarded to Wilton Krogman, an internationally acclaimed bone expert, and he's actually one of the world's foremost human comparative anatomists.
Was he excited about this?
Oh, he was. He said, this is a premolar tooth. And he said, man, you've got something that's going to go down in the book on human paleontology. An unbeatable combination, hominoid teeth and mammalian bone.
Did it ever go down in history?
Well, Krogman recommended that an infrared scan be done, and it was sent to the American Medical Laboratories in Fairfax, Virginia, and they confirmed what he suspected. Now, Ed sent a copy of the scan to a man called Rye at the Smithsonian, and that was ignored. He made other requests for several major universities, and they were ignored. And then he learned from a newspaper article that a medical surgeon in Pennsylvania was able to interpret the scans. And this man agreed to do so. And in his response, he said, the scan identifies your material as compatible with either tooth or bone in origin. So Ed was being confirmed by one expert, now another expert. But anyway, he continued to battle the super scientists to get his discovery examined, and for over 20 years they kept giving him the royal runaround. Just rocks, they said.
And he
Human
kept at it.
remains could never be found in coal. Shut up, Ed, case closed.
But he wouldn't stop.
No, he wouldn't stop. And in fact, I spoke to Ed just this week, just 2 or 3 days ago, and I told him I was going to come on your program, and hopefully we might just mention this,
Sure.
George. Ed said, I'm willing to go on TV with the Smithsonian experts, and he challenges anybody on the face of this planet to sit down with him and an independent board of review and watch the videos of the testing. Well, what he's found blows the evolution theory sky high, and it destroys the succession of geological ages that we've been hearing in the schools and universities.
That's remarkable. It really is.
It's explosive stuff.
Let's move over to the Americas for a moment. Tell me about this case of a Captain Don Henry who found a 400-foot pyramid on the seabed off of Florida. Tell me about that.
Well, that was back in 1976, and Captain Henry was 40 miles off the southern coast of Florida, and he was directing sonar soundings of the floor of the ocean. And suddenly, up came this immense pyramid-shaped object. Now, this was about 300 feet below the surface of the sea, and later underwater closed-circuit TV was brought in, and it showed the pyramid to be about 420 feet high. Now, that's a pretty tall building.
That's a tall building. Yep.
And you were mentioning skyscrapers earlier, George. Well, there's one for sure.
Yep.
Nearly the size of the Great Pyramids of Egypt.
How far off of Florida was it?
About 40 miles. So anyone who wants to just go out to sea, if they've got the equipment, they could go and look for it.
So it must have been on an island. I don't think, unless Florida was that long, that wide, and then something happened to that portion of it.
Well, it does appear that over the last 4,000 years, the seabed has risen about 300 to 500 feet. I'm sorry, the sea has risen over the seabed. The land has either sunk or the sea has risen. And this would have been part of the North American continent at that time, I guess.
That's something. You talk about how the Mayans had surgical instruments that were thousands of times sharper than our own modern platinum. Tell me about this.
Yes, they were. Actually, they're made of obsidian glass, which is volcanic glass, actually. And some modern surgeons have even used them because they have great faith that they see the trepanning that was done by the ancient American tribes, and they see the brain, the apparent brain surgery and heart surgery that was conducted using these instruments, and There was a case, actually, of a girl who was very seriously injured in a motor car accident back there in the 1960s, and one surgeon chose, above modern instruments, to use some of the old ones, and because they were sharp, they didn't cut the cells so badly, and she survived beautifully, as well as anyone in a modern hospital.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's the case of the Peruvian surgeon, isn't it?
Yeah, he was a Peruvian surgeon, yes. And the Mayans, the Peruvians, the Aztecs, they all had a fair knowledge of this, and there must have been quite a bit of sharing going on, I think.
Tell me about this vast artificial tunnel in Ecuador.
Oh, that one really does end. You've got me going on that one. When I first wrote Dead Men's Secrets, I had heard about this. I mean, I've been in the Amazon, and to me, that's one of the most lovely places on earth, apart from the bugs and all that, and wild people. But it's beautiful, unspoiled, it's forgotten, and there, as in many continents, in fact, all continents, there are vast underground tunnel systems that just don't go for a mile or two, but they go for hundreds, maybe even thousands of miles. Now, when I first wrote about this particular one in eastern Ecuador, in the Ecuador, eastern Peru, Brazilian region, and the eastern side of the Andes Mountains, I was incensed when I had discovered that Westerners were coming into the Amazon, and they were coming in by helicopter over little pockets of clearing in the jungle where they could see a couple of houses where there was an Indian tribe, because they live in little clusters like that. And they were dropping lollies and sweets laced with arsenic and typhus. And naturally, something coming out of the sky like that, these simple people would pick it up.
Think they were, yeah.
They'd want to taste it, and they would die. And then these lovely people who gave them the gift would come in and seize their land and start opening it up for cattle or for prospecting for gold or whatever else. And this has been going on, as you very well know, and some of us are pretty upset about it. And this particular tribe got in contact. In fact, their chief went to civilization. He eventually got down to a city of Manaus on the Amazon River, and he spoke to Karl Brugger, who was a German native expert and freelance writer and investigator. And he pled for the West to stop the genocide that was taking place. And Brugger came out with a rather good book at that time, and I was familiar with his discoveries, and so I decided I'd just put a little bit about that in my book, Dead Men's Secrets. And
it's all over the planet, isn't it?
Yes.
High technology, strange stories. I mean, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere. And what happened, George, was that this tribe, 30,000 of them actually, a whole nipped family group of tribes, went underground. They decided this was the only safe course they could take, and they went in to live at some of the underground cities that were already existing from ancient times. Now, soon after my book came out, well, pretty soon after, a Canadian scientist contacted me. He's become a good friend now, Jerry, and he said, look, we were prospecting and exploring in the Amazon, and my group was ambushed by a tribe, and I was taken. They got away, but I became a prisoner, and I was led through the tunnel system to their city. And as you approach a city underground, you get to a certain level, and suddenly lights start coming on automatically. When you go past that area, the lights go off behind you.
Weird.
Ancient, very ancient.
And you know that this civilization didn't build this. It was done way before them.
This present civilization is only occupying it. That's right.
Yeah, it is.
And we can go to Europe and Africa. In fact, in South America, one of your presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, was shown the entrances to more tunnels in Chile. The British missionary, what was his name? David Livingstone was taken into tunnels in Africa.
Along with Stanley.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, and the astronaut, the first man to walk on the moon, went with another Stanley Hall, into a tunnel system in Ecuador, and they explored underground for 2 months. And I've corresponded with Mr. Hall, and he's a very level-headed fellow, and so was Neil Armstrong, and they actually had the support, and they were accompanied by members from the University of Edinburgh and the University of Quito. So these are real. These do exist. I've had friends go to an underground tunnel system in Spain, and they've sent me photographs of what they photographed while they're underground.
Well, Columbus may have discovered the New World in 1492, but there were others way before him.
Oh, most certainly. The myth of Columbus being the discoverer, he was only the rediscoverer, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was the modern one.
The modern, that's right.
You've talked about maps, ancient maps of the world that have, disappeared? Vanished?
Yes. There are several of these, actually, which are based upon a spherical Earth. So they knew the Earth was round, and they knew longitude and latitude, which was later forgotten and only rediscovered in the last couple of 100 years. They drew their maps on that basis. The curvature of the Earth is very obvious on the maps they draw of Antarctica and North America and South America, for example, and Asia as well. Where the curves are, it's not like you see on a flat map, it's like you see on a circular globe.
You have talked about the 2,000-ton stone building blocks in Lebanon and Baalbek.
Yes.
To me, they were landing ports. I don't know.
Well, they were certainly sophisticated. They were done with machinery. I have no doubt about that. They were cut around.
And they were put in place, weren't they?
They were put in place, yes. And today they form a foundation upon which the two largest Roman temples in the whole Roman world were later built, but they dwarfed those temples.
It's truly amazing. Well, when we come back, Jonathan, I want to talk about your latest work, The Weapon of the Globalist Sphere, and find out exactly what that amazing secret is that you've discovered, and we'll talk about that. Next hour, we'll open up the phone lines and give you an opportunity to chat with Jonathan Gray. His works, of course, Dead Men's Secrets in The Weapon, the Globalist Sphere, and others. Just simply go to his website, which is linked up at coasttocoastam.com. beforeus.com. I'll be back in a moment with Jonathan Gray, and we'll talk about this amazing secret. What could it be? Well, next hour, we'll take your phone calls with the international explorer and archaeologist, Jonathan Gray. But I'll be back with him in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Jonathan, in your work, The Weapon, the Globalist Sphere, you talk about an amazing secret in the foundation rocks of our planet. Now, tell me about that. What does that mean?
Yes. Well, perhaps we could look at that first. I think that's a good idea.
Okay.
Right. Now, back in 1965, one spring day, there was a young American scientist peering through his microscope at some very thin, translucent sections of granite-type rocks. And suddenly it struck him, George, this had the potential to turn an established theory, global theory, upside down. What he was looking at could raise an uproar in the scientific world. And as a result of mentioning it, he lost his funding. Now, what had he found? He had found physical, scientific evidence that can be tested under any laboratory that shows that the foundation rocks of our continents solidified not over millions of years, slowly cooling from liquid to solid, but within minutes. The molten rock became suddenly solid.
Within
How did he know
minutes?
This? Yes, in minutes, not days or years or centuries. Now, just suppose you dropped a Alka-Seltzer into a glass of water. It has a very short life, doesn't it? The beginning of effervescence.
Fizz, fizz, and it's gone.
It's gone, yes. Now, what he had found was tiny bubbles, little bubbles of polonium inside the granite rocks of our planet worldwide.
While they all solidified.
Yes, and polonium bubbles only have a half-life of 3 minutes. Otherwise, they would have dispersed before the rock solidified.
Interesting.
Now, he published this in the magazines of peer review. He battled the establishment for more than 20 years. And what he was finding was this, that the granite was in a liquid state, then it was frozen into solidified granite within a matter of minutes and left behind the halo bubbles before they disappeared.
And this is all when the planet was forming?
When the planet was forming. These were frozen into the solid granite. That's a physical fact that anyone can see and test. Now, this is not generally promoted in the scientific world because it becomes a challenge.
Yeah, tell me the significance of this discovery.
Significance of the discovery is that our planet had to have been created and solidified in a very short time, just like the book of Genesis in the Old Testament is telling us.
Like in days?
I beg your pardon?
In days?
In minutes.
That is remarkable.
It had to happen in less than 3 minutes. And that's globally on every continent of our planet. All the foundation of our rocks have these halos in them, these bubbles preserved and frozen.
So in the state that the planet might have been in, let's say it was in a gas state before this all happened, right?
Yeah.
Instantly, I guess it would be instantly, everything solidified.
Instantly, everything solidified. Now, this was actually presented to the National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Robert Gentry is the scientist's name. He published unrefuted evidence for an instant creation in Nature magazine, in Science, in Applied Physical Letters, and others. Now, the evolutionist-controlled National Academy of Sciences strongly opposed this horrifying idea, even claiming that the evidence for creation had been scientifically invalidated. And so Gentry went back and he said, wait a minute, please publicly explain where the palladium halo evidence has ever been scientifically invalidated. And it was embarrassing. They couldn't disprove him.
Are you saying that this is a backing of God?
He said, what else could it be? It was a sudden intervention in the liquid state, and it froze in 3 minutes.
Hence, the globalists don't want us to know this.
They don't want us to know this. And why don't they want us to know, George? I do believe that what we've got here is a philosophy that's taken over our planet, and it's a battle now between a document and the death squad. I mean, we all know that there's a plan put into operation now to eliminate most of the world's population. And the planners say this needs to be done so they can have their utopia world. Now we've got this coming along, which is a bombshell set to explode in their face.
They would love another calamity as long as they weren't part of it.
Oh, yes. They'll be the minority, won't they, who survive?
Yep.
Now, we might be aghast at the dangers of a nuclear bomb at the hands of terrorists or renegade governments, but even more deadly than all of this is this intellectual bomb that's been let loose upon us. It's the nihilistic mindset that's been dominating scientific thought for the last 150 years. It's based upon the theory that we are here by accident, we are all useless eaters, and that the survival of the fittest means that the use of force and cruelty to crush the weak is justified. That's the mindset that's taken over our planet.
Well, that's true. Now, how did, in the book of Genesis, did they know this? Did they know the timetable of the formation of the solar system, the planets? How did they know this?
Well, the writers of the book of Genesis state that the Creator actually conveyed the information to them, because they, of course, were not witnesses, but whoever was around at that time conveyed the information and said, this is how I did it.
What do you think?
So this means that the book of Genesis is no longer relegated to fantasy and myth. We've got here scientific corroboration of its claim.
In minutes. It said, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
And this is the document they hate. And you can understand why now. The the taking over of our educational establishment, of our scientific establishment, and of virtually every establishment that now controls our society has been done with a purpose in mind to control, to eliminate, and to discredit the Book of Genesis. And I mean, that's the one book of all books that the establishment is against. It's like they'll discredit it, they'll poo-hoo it, they'll say it's myths, they'll say it's nonsense or it's religious garbage, but they will not admit that it's scientific truth, because that will awaken people to say, hey, we're not useless eaters. We're not people who have no value. We are valuable people. We were created. We were given dignity. Our families are to be free. We are to be respected, and we are to respect one another. That's the message of Genesis.
That's a great story. I mean,
it's the opposite from the agenda that's now being put into action.
How come this isn't publicized other than in your work?
Well, I guess I stumbled across this, and I'm out now, George, to get the world to know this, and I hope I get a few helpers, because this is going to empower people to be courageous and to have some hope at last, after all.
Other than divine intervention, scientifically, what caused it to form so fast?
It could not form so fast given its own natural state. It would have had to taken slowly. There had to have been intervention.
There was intervention. Something.
Yeah.
Some divine power.
Yes.
Kicked this thing into high gear.
Exactly. That's the only scientific thing that makes sense about it. Because you take the laws of nature, they wouldn't let it happen.
Would you assume the other planets were formed the same way?
Well, we can only extrapolate, I suppose, from our own planet, but I suppose it would make sense that if it happened to this planet, it would happen to others.
Pretty remarkable. Let's take just the few minutes that we have, and then we'll take phone calls next hour with you, Jonathan. Back about structures on other planets and on the moon.
Yes.
They could be there.
Well, yes, they could very well be there. And they have and I believe they have a human explanation. I mean, we've been to the moon before. We've been to the moon now. We do not have to invent people from worlds in many galaxies away to have constructed these. We're very close ourselves. Why couldn't we have done it?
I think it's happened. I think people who think they see structures on the moon or on Mars, I think they're right. The Hoaglands and people like that. Yes,
I believe you're right. And it's interesting that the Russian Sputniks went. There was a Russian probe to Mars some years ago, and they looked down and they believed that they had seen a structure of a city, a circular city with streets going out like spokes of a wheel. And, of course, they were shouted down by the West, and I think perhaps the Russian scientists had seen something there.
I believe that there were nuclear wars on this planet in the past, don't you?
Oh, most certainly, yes.
I mean, there's a lot of evidence. You know, there's green glass in the deserts there. And what causes that?
Atomic energy is able to cause that.
So what's new for you next? Where do you go after the the weapon of the globalist sphere? Is that the book out yet? I couldn't find it.
Oh, I see. No, it's only available on my website at the moment, George, but I hope we can get it out to a wider audience soon.
Okay, I was looking at it on the website, but I went on Amazon a week ago to try to pick it up, and it's not up there yet. We got to get you on that.
Thank you.
Get you going with that. Now, the speed of all of this, you are convinced then mankind, intelligent mankind, is how old?
I'm convinced that if the Book of Genesis is correct, we've got to take it more seriously than we have been. And that there is no reason to believe that there's no scientific reason why the strata of the Earth that we see today in the geological column could not have all been laid down by catastrophe, mostly during that great disaster in the past, and that what we look at as taking millions or hundreds of millions of years was not necessarily so, because this strata shows us. I mean, we've got, for example, in my book, I've got a picture of a man in Newcastle coalfields in Australia standing beside a tree that penetrates 14 strata of coal. And by the geological theory, each one of those 14 would have taken millions of years to have been laid down. But here's one tree, undissolved, not rotted away, standing up, penetrating 14 layers of coal. Now, we call these objects polystrate, and they're not rare. They're all over the world. They show that the beds of rock were laid down rapidly before their contents had time to decay. So this gives us, from the Precambrian up to the most recent, a very short time span for laying down of strata. And if you go up to Mount St. Helens, where the eruption, what year was that?
Oh, geez. That was some time ago.
Yeah, about the 1980s or something, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Quite a while. There's strata there that has hundreds of layers, just like our strata in the rocks around the world today. And all those were formed in just 2 days. A whole canyon, I think about 150 feet deep, was formed in 1 day. So catastrophe can cause these things to happen.
Our listeners are quick. May 18th, 1980. That's when the eruption started.
Okay, well, thank you. That was wonderful. Yeah, 1980, great. Now, coal doesn't take millions of years to form. Coal has been formed in the laboratory in just 28 days. Good, black, good grade coal.
Can we do the same thing with diamonds?
I believe so, yes. All of these things can be done artificially, and they can be done in a short period of time. So when we're saying it must take millions of years, it doesn't must take millions of years. It can happen very quickly, given a catastrophic laying down of the strata.
You know of the work of Michael Cremo, no doubt, right?
Yes, a wonderful work, and very similar to mine in many ways. He touches on an ancient technology, and I love his work on that.
Have you two ever worked together?
I've never met Michael.
Good guy.
Yes, I believe so.
You'd like him. And you're in Australia right now, right?
Actually, not too far away. We're in the little Isles of New Zealand.
And you have escaped the floods down there, Jonathan?
Yes, thank you, George. We have. In fact, we're getting a violently hot summer down here. It's beautiful, really, but El Nino is bringing New Zealand to the tropics in climate this summer.
It is ironic, though. Now. We're talking about these calamities. Australia's got a big one down there.
Well, I've got a colleague in Australia, and he's surrounded. He couldn't get out of his house for more than a week. And when he did get out, he couldn't get home for almost a fortnight.
This theory of the rock formation, do you think that's the smoking gun?
Yes, I think you've put that very beautifully. This is the smoking gun that can destroy the work of the globalist agenda. And also, it can destroy the evolution theory, which has brought about this nihilistic attitude, unfortunately.
At what point in your career did you think evolution was hogwash?
When I began to investigate for dead men's secrets, and suddenly all these out of place artifacts started no longer to make sense within the framework that we'd been taught. And it became obvious that a caveman had sophisticated clothing, for example. But we've got cave drawings that go back several thousand years, and these were contemporary with the post-flood civilizations. I think there's good evidence for this now because of the structure or the type of artwork that they had in the caves is very similar to that of the early Sumerians and Egyptians. The caveman artwork, and it shows people in pantsuits and with purses and hats and all sorts of things. This indicates that caveman had a civilized beginning, and just like today, up here in New Zealand, we've got a man who went bush and became living in a cave. He was a school teacher before that, but he got a little bit sick of the rat race. Mm-hmm. So cave people had to take refuge when their cities were destroyed by nuclear holocaust or by some natural means, and they are not the remnants of evolution. They're rather the survivors of destruction of civilization.
How many forgotten secrets are out there, or hidden secrets?
In my book, I've listed just over 1,000, but that's just the tip of it. Tens of thousands. I went through tens of thousands to whittle it down to that.
Speaking of tips, you said the Egyptians had power drills that worked 500 times faster than what we have.
500 times faster, and that's the verdict of experts who are involved in that industry.
By looking at the boring, I guess?
That's right, yeah.
That is dramatic all by itself. Of everything you've investigated, Jonathan, everything, what one secret just blows your mind?
That's a hard one. Well, I do think probably that.
By the way, you sound like the angel in the movie "It's a Wonderful Life." You do. You sound like Clarence, here to rescue
George,
all of
I
us.
always love talking with you. I think it's so much fun.
But if there's one thing out there that you stumbled across that you just shake your head, what is it?
I think it's the underground tunnels that go for hundreds of miles, and many of the long distance of them shows that they've been cut with something like a laser beam, because there's no residue, no rubble on the outside or anywhere. It just looks like it's been cut and the rock's been melted.
Well, maybe the old Jules Verne story of Journey to the Center of the Earth is real.
Well, fiction is often very true to fact.
Well, absolutely. You want to take some phone calls for the final hour?
Yeah, that'd be great.
We'll do that. Okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to open up the phone lines. We'll give you an opportunity to talk with Jonathan Gray about dead men's secrets and the weapons the globalists fear. You've heard what we've been talking about, so I'm sure my gosh, the phones are ringing already. So we'll be back in just a moment. If you need to email me, that's George at coast2coastam.com, and also go to our website. Those of you who are interested in spending pennies a day to become a Coast Insider, you can do all that by going to coasttocoastam.com as well. We'll be right back with your phone calls on Coast to Coast AM. Well, we've got the international explorer, Jonathan Gray, with us, and we're going to take your calls with him when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back. We're with Jonathan Gray. Jonathan, have you ever gone on a dinosaur bone dig?
No, but I know people who have. I have friends that have been. That's a very interesting occupation.
Sure is. That's got to be pretty fulfilling too, huh?
Oh, yes, very fulfilling. And another interesting thing about dinosaurs is that dinosaur blood has been found still to exist in dinosaur bones.
If you can find dinosaur blood, can't you clone it?
Well, I suppose that would be possible, yes.
Jurassic Park, here we go.
Mm.
That's fascinating. Is it a good career for somebody going to school right now to become an archaeologist?
Oh, yes. Yes, there's still plenty to be found. In fact, the consensus is that the discoveries in Egypt probably would still outnumber by 100 to 1 what we've already found under the desert sands.
And what about jobs? Where do they generally work? At the university level?
Yes, normally.
Okay, let's go take some calls here. We'll go to first-time caller, Richard in Los Angeles. You're up with us. Hey, Richard, go ahead.
Yes, hi, George.
Hi,
Jonathan. I have a question for you. It was in regard to you were mentioning Genesis and the debunking of evolution and these globalists not wanting that to be exposed. And what I'm wondering is, couldn't there be any divine intervention? Can God intervene in some way? Why are they allowed to carry out this monstrous plan? What can we do?
Well, I think individually, that's a big subject and would require probably a whole broadcast. But what we can do is to share the news with others around us until it becomes such a worldwide knowledge that they'll have a hard job suppressing the people that they want to get rid of.
Yes, but how do you suggest
people
as
are
an
waking
individual?
Up. Yeah, people are waking up, I'm glad to say. We just want everyone to wake up because it's going to be much harder for them to fulfill their agenda if they realize it's not going to be as easy as they thought they had made it.
Well, thank you for this program, and thank both of you. Thank you very much.
Sure thing. Tell me about cavemen and their paintings that go back thousands of years. What have you uncovered there?
Well, cave paintings are a very interesting subject. Down in the Kalahari Desert of southwest Africa, there are cave paintings of men in elaborate garments, men with blonde beards, well-styled hair, and they wear boots, multicolored shirts, coats, gloves, boots. There's a woman wearing a short-sleeve pullover, closely fitting breeches and gloves and garters and slippers. How about that?
Okay, let's go to Phoenix, Arizona. Virgil, west of the Rockies. Hi, Virgil.
Hey, good morning. How are you guys doing this morning?
Great.
Great. I am so glad to be able to talk with you guys about this. This is awesome. Well, concerning the ancient knowledge and history and stuff like that, I have a story to tell you guys. See, I'm of Apache Navajo descent. My grandmother was a medicine woman out on the reservation, and she told me a story one night when I was a little kid about the stars, and that this story was passed down to her from her great-grandfather from his great-grandfather, back generations. But the story goes is that out there in space, that it's dark, it's cold, there's no oxygen, that you wouldn't be able to breathe out there, and that if you were to take a rock and throw it, it would keep on going until it actually hit something.
That's pretty magical.
Yeah, and, it just kind of...
What's the physics behind that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of just got me thinking as a little kid, because I'm a student of anthropology, and it got me thinking about where this knowledge came from, how they knew that there was no oxygen up there, and that the physics of them knowing that being no gravity, that things could keep on going until it hit something.
Okay. I stumbled across, by the way, Jonathan, an old movie of military troops. They were in Afghanistan. It was a movie now. And they stumbled across Vermonas, flying machines.
Oh, wow, how intriguing.
Yeah, it was a great little movie. I mean, I got a kick out of watching that. Fascinating work. I mean, but where are they? Where are the devices, most of them? What happened to them?
Well, there's a computer in the Athens Museum. There's a skull with a bullet hole in it, a skull of an Egyptian mummy in the British Museum. There also the skull of an animal shot with some weapon that had the speed of a bullet in the Museum of Anthropology in Moscow. There are objects found in coal and in Precambrian in museums, private museums in the United States. They're scattered around a bit.
Okay, next up we go to Wilmington, Delaware. Robert, east of the Rockies. Robert, go ahead.
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good. It's a good day.
I've been fascinated with these caves myself. I've seen them on the internet. Are they searching these caves to see if they can find maybe dinosaurs or,
Yeah, when they go into these caves, Jonathan, what are they looking for?
Well, people do look for those sort of things, but more what they find is not too much, except the empty tunnels, and unless they come to the remains of where people used to live in the cities. However, my friend who was kidnapped by that tribe in the Amazon,
yes,
he spent 4 months, I understand, there before they let him out. And while there, they showed him something that I had actually written about in Dead Men's Secrets in my chapter on tunnels. And that was an ancient flying machine that was still preserved there by the people left behind.
Wow. Was it workable? Do you know?
He sat in it, and during that time he made very careful measurements, and he now has the specifications for this in his own possession. He's hoping to have somebody who can build a replica.
Did it have an engine, did he say?
No, he hasn't gone that far. He hasn't told me that much, but it had some means of propulsion. But going from my other research, there seems to have been several ways in which ancient aircraft could lift off. One was the use of mercury in flight. There's something about mercury that we don't use. The French actually tried to use it in a possible space program a few years ago. I'm not sure of the result of that, but mercury is one. Electromagnetism is another. These are methods we don't use. Well, we use, of course, gas, petroleum, and so on, which is a sledgehammer, a way to get off the ground and fly. I mean, that's trying to beat the laws of nature instead of work with them.
Tell me about these lights that went on and off from this tribe down in the tunnels.
Well, these lights actually were part of a technology that appears to have been worldwide. When the Spaniards came to South America, the conquistadors, they reported that a city at night could still be seen with its lights on.
Was it limestone, you think?
I'm not sure. They were on pillars about 20 feet tall, and they were big globes on top of the pillars, which shone with luminescence at night. In the daytime, of course, that wasn't obvious. But as the darkness came on, the light would get brighter and brighter and brighter and light up the old streets.
Okay, back to our wild card line now. We'll go to Leonard in Hinckley, Minnesota. There you go, Leonard. You're up.
Hi, George. Great show.
Hi.
Thanks for having me
He's
on.
doing a great job for us.
Yes. Jonathan, I got to say that everything you said tonight is just so interesting and enlightening. And my favorite thing you told us is that, the scientific proof for the Earth being created in such a short period of time. But my question is regarding the Sumerians and their snake, their deity being a snake. And when I learned about that, I was curious to know, is there any connection between the Sumerian deity and possibly the Hebrews and how Adam and Eve encountered a snake, maybe using it as an example of untrue knowledge in comparison?
Yes, there is quite a similarity. As a matter of fact, all nations had a legend of mankind being seduced by a being who took the form of a snake. And serpent worship became a worldwide phenomenon, still is in many parts of the world. And the earthly, that was the earthly counterpart of what later on became sun worship as well. The sun being the enlightener physically of the planet, they stated that the serpent became the spiritual enlightener of the planet and led man away from his creator so that he could do his own thing. And that was the perversion of an original core of truth. Very interesting how all the nations took it on.
In Egypt, many of the structures, the statues, have that bird look to it, alligator head look to it. What do you think they were?
The bird symbol actually was another part of the same legend that the first woman saw with her eyes something that tempted her, and that the serpent was involved in the temptation. But the hawk then became a symbol of the woman because the hawk's eye. And this brought the bird's head into the symbolism of the gods and goddesses of the pagans.
Okay, we go next to Palos Verdes in California, west of the Rockies. Hey, Bill, go ahead.
Oh, hi, George. Hi, Jonathan.
Hi.
Fantastic. Hi. Incredibly relevant. I live in Palos Verdes Estates, and it kind of combines all the elements that you've been talking about tonight. This has one of the highest per capita incomes in the U.S., and it's kind of off the beaten track. And a lot of the top minds in aerospace live there. And anyway, it's the chemtrail, the cross hatch is just centered over the community a lot. And the last 5 years has been such incredible erosion. I mean, you can see it, from the right angle. You can see hieroglyphics. You can see symbols, lettering, code, all over the cliff in different angles. You can see these elaborate face carvings. And I think there's ancient secrets because, the archaeology there's been extensive and everyone, super tight-lipped. You can't find any information at all. And that's really incredible. The erosion the last 5 years. I think they're using the chemtrails to foliate and defoliate areas they've either, uncovered and want to cover back up. And another thing, the last 2 weeks, the ocean bottom there has just come loose. It's unbelievable. Giant boulders, tonnage and giant reefs have just come loose and been washing in, just to form a whole different situation. And you have all kinds of military, stuff, and they, the civilians and military, they have a elaborate system of communicating ship to probably crafts in the sky, planes, and probably satellites and whatever. And there's been in 2008, 2009, and now the last couple of months, there's been this frenzied activity, like convoys of cars, just punching around, just in a
something's
big hurry.
Going on.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, you can visibly see all the hieroglyphics in the cliff, and I think it has some navigational value and whatnot.
Have you heard, Jonathan, about ancient Egyptian artifacts found in the Grand Canyon?
Oh, yes. A Smithsonian explorer is reported to have discovered this cave way up high above the present river level. And Well, what he actually found was also a dock for ships up there too. So the level of the canyon must have dropped rather quickly in just a few thousand years. But inside there were mummies and Egyptian hieroglyphics, and apparently, according to the original report, artifacts were taken to the Smithsonian, but they deny having them now.
Jeez, amazing. What do you think of Noah's Ark? Where is it? Is it there? Is it up there on Mount Ararat?
I started out as quite a skeptic on that, George. I heard claims being made, and I took my own teams. We've been back there quite a number of times, and we have found the remains of a structure which is the same length as described in the book of Genesis.
Real? How high up?
About between 6,000 and 7,000, but not on Mount Ararat itself. It's to the south.
Okay.
Interestingly, the book of Genesis doesn't say Mount Ararat. It says the mountains of Ararat.
The mountains of. That's true.
Yeah. And Mount Ararat itself is apparently a post-flood volcanic mountain. It's only about 3,500 years old. It's come up in Turkish history.
Well, if this is tied into that calamity from 2345 BC, and then Noah got the inside scoop to start building the ark, then there must have been divine intervention.
He could not have known 120 years before and how he had to go about it unless there had been intervention. I believe you're right.
Bob in Miami, Florida, you're up with us. Go ahead, Bob.
Yes, how you doing, George? Jonathan, how you doing?
Hi.
Hi.
You guys were talking about Genesis. I'd like to add on to it.
Okay.
Okay. Jonathan, you said that the Earth cooled really fast, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and then George made a statement, said that the Earth was a gas planet at that time, right? Okay, now, what was it before it was a gas planet? I'm not done yet, George. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, what we go back to is a first cause. And there is no, according to the laws of cause and effect, which we know are confirmed, the effect cannot be greater than the cause. In other words, matter or gas could not form from non-matter and non-gas. So we go back to a first cause again, which is who I guess we call that first cause God, the same one that created the earth and solidified it fast.
Okay. Now I'm going to read from Genesis, from the Old and the Testament. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and this is my point. The earth was without form.
See, but to me, something gaseous would be without form.
Yes, I agree with you.
A gas cloud, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, now Moses wrote Genesis, right?
Actually, in my book, The Weapon, the Globalist Fear, I'm giving archaeological evidence that Moses did compile Genesis, but that he had at his fingertips a series of tablets that were written by eyewitnesses at the successive time of the events that are recorded, so that the record was made very close to the events and then handed down from father to son until Moses compiled them into one book.
Okay, but my point is this. How did Moses know that the earth was without form?
Well, Moses had the tablets in front of him, and the first two tablets are written by Adam because they actually have his signature on the bottom of them.
Well, how did Adam know that?
He could only have been told by his Creator, and
exactly.
He does record that his Creator spoke to him.
Right, that's my hope. Somebody had to tell him.
Somebody had to tell him that part because he wasn't alive when it happened.
Exactly. And my money is on God.
That's good money. You might be right. You're going to collect on that one.
My money's on God, exactly.
All right. Hey, thanks. We're going to come back in just a moment. We're going to take more phone calls with Jonathan Gray, our final segment here on Coast to Coast AM. We're talking about two of his works, Dead Men's Secrets and The Weapon the Globalists Fear. And, of course, that we reviewed has to do with the formation of the planet and how it was done. Jonathan is convinced it was done by divine intervention. Jonathan, do you have an email you want to give out at all? Do you want people to write you?
Oh, that would be nice, yes. Info@archaeology answers.com, but I always have to spell archaeology, George, because it's a difficult word. A for America, R for Rabbit, C for Charlie, H for Hannibal, A for America, E for Elephant, O for Orange. Now, the rest of it comes easy. Archaeology Answers.
Yeah, you got to get that AE in there. That's the tough part. We'll be back in a moment. Final calls next. And on our next Coast to Coast program, Sir Charles Schultz joins us, a fossil hunter's guide to Mars. So get ready for that one when we come back tomorrow night on Coast to Coast AM. Jonathan, tell me about the story in the India-Pakistan area of a man turned to glass. What happened there? You remember that one?
Oh, well, yes. That happened over in India in the 1800s. The gentleman was exploring in the northeastern forests, and his foot gave way into a hole below him, and he made a larger aperture, and he pushed his way down, and he found himself in a room. But the whole room had turned to glass. Sitting there on a chair appeared to be a statue made of glass, and the gentleman looked, but inside that statue he could see internal.
Oh, organs, everything.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Obviously, this whole person was now glass. And there's only one thing can do that, and that's atomic energy.
Wow. Something happened there.
Yeah. And it's interesting that this area, of course, is part of a story in one of the old Indian documents. It speaks of nations at war with each other, that where one missile struck a city and destroyed it straight out.
Didn't they find some radioactive skeletons in Pakistan?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
In the ruins of Mohenjo-daro in the Indus Valley area, there is a square that has been unearthed, a city square. The buildings around the square have evidence of having been melted from radiated heat from above, and there are quite a number of skeletons there that have been found to be radioactive. In one particular human interest case, it looked like a woman and a man holding hands with a child, and they didn't get out in time.
All right, let's go back to the phones. Mason City, Iowa. Justin's with us on Coast to Coast. Hi, Justin. Go ahead.
Hi, I got really a comment and then a question.
Sure.
My comment is I'm really glad to hear as a Christian that there's been scientific proof that the Earth was created. And my question to you is, George, a couple of years ago, I believe it was Timothy Geithner, I can't be for sure, but someone in Washington was talking about a one-world justice system. And then I started thinking about the New World Order. I was just wondering, in your opinion, how long do you think we are away from the New World Order?
Well, I think we're right in it. And that was Zbigniew Brzezinski who was talking about that. And one of the things he was mentioning was that how all of us were becoming aware of what they wanted to do. But I would say within 5 years, we'll see even more dramatic pushes to get this thing done. They're moving pretty darn fast now.
Yeah, they sure are. I spoke to a friend as around about, I think it was 1990, and mentioning the New World Order, and he was incredulous. He said, "Oh, you're making that up." He hadn't heard of it, but everybody, I think, is hearing about it now. It's a reality.
Absolutely. Let's go to Amber, Tri-Cities in the state of Washington, first-time caller. Hello, Amber. Go ahead.
Hi. I was wondering about the correlation of the pyramids, the Aztec temples, the Stonehenge, and other temples compared to where they may have been before the continental divide, and the alignment with the Bermuda Triangle. What do you guys kind of thought about that?
All right. Jonathan, first of all, the similarities of all these pyramids.
Yeah, it's very interesting. At certain times in history, we have certain building styles. I mean, today, we've got the 21st century, 20th century, 21st century building style, the skyscrapers and so on, and shop fronts and whatever. And worldwide, that's more or less taken on. In the 1800s, you wouldn't see that. So it does change. Each period has its own characteristics. And the pyramids of Egypt, the pyramids of China, the pyramids on Tahiti, in Australia, in the Americas, all have similarities which suggest they were all constructed in the same general period of time. Although there have been out-of-place periods in which pyramid construction has been made. I know they built one in Las Vegas, didn't they?
It's called the Luxor.
That's right. Yes. The general period was consistent with probably the period round about 2150 through to about 1800 BC, more or less. And that would include the original pyramids in Mexico, some of which were predecessors of the ones that followed.
Tell me about this mystery satellite orbiting the poles. What do we know about this?
Oh, the Black Knight.
Yeah.
Yes, that actually was tracked by quite a number of scientists, and still is by some.
Who put it up there?
Well, when America put up her first satellite and the Russians put up theirs, back in October 1957, I think Sputnik 1 went up, and just a few months later, America had hers in orbit. And these were only a few hundred miles above the Earth, but then with excitement, almost with unbelief, millions of people who were scanning this heard a report that French astronomer Jacques Vallée of the Paris Observatory had seen another satellite 3 times, and he got 11 data points in 45 seconds. It was orbiting in reverse, actually, at an altitude of about 22,000 miles above the Earth, very different from our few hundred miles. And so the question was, how did it get there?
How did it get there, and where did it come from?
Yeah. Now, if we go back to the ancient writings, we notice the Babylonians spoke of satellites orbiting the Earth. Others spoke of spacecraft going to the moon and to the planets of the solar system. So it appears there was a technology capable of doing it just a few thousand years ago, George, and my bet is that's probably from that time. But it hasn't come crashing down to Earth like some of ours do.
Strange.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I assume we still know it's up there.
Apparently, yes. The latest reports are that it's still there. Now, the report I had latest was about a year ago.
Name of our first satellite was the Explorer 1, a long time ago.
Yeah.
Let's go to Sebastopol, California. Marshall, it's your turn on Coast to Coast. Hi, Marshall.
Hi, George. How you doing?
Good.
Thank you for the show tonight. It's really good. I've been wanting to call in for the last couple of weeks. You've had a number of good shows. Tonight is exceptionally well, and I wanted to talk about something you hit on earlier with you asked the question of where is Noah's Ark? And I've run across some information in the last few years, not directly about Noah's Ark, but actually looking for Noah's tomb and his son's tombs and things like that.
Okay.
I ran across the work of Dr. Bill Shea, and I was wondering if Jonathan had ever heard of him or heard of his work.
Oh, yes. I've communicated with Dr. Bill Shea on a couple of occasions. He's a very thorough investigator, and he was of the opinion that it landed in a similar area to where we sent our expeditions.
Right. There is the site that was researched by Ron Wyatt, and then there is the site that is in actually Armenia, which is the site that he proposes. But what he found in his the article that I ran across with him, he was actually tracing back the sites of the sons, Japheth, Ham, Shem, and Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and they said they found their tomb sites. And I emailed him and I asked him for any other further research, and he sent me. He had done 3 expeditions, and he sent me information about that. And I've posted those online at on legendarytimes.com in their forum section. And so if anybody wants to read that, they can go do that. He also has a book that's available that goes into more depth about that. So I was wondering if you'd read any of that.
No, I haven't, but I'd be very interested in you emailing me if you go to my website and sending me some information. That'd be fascinating.
Okay, very good. Let's go to Harlingen, Texas. Glenn's with us east of the Rockies. Hey, Glenn, thanks for calling.
Hey, George, Jonathan, how you doing?
Good.
Pretty well, Glenn.
Say, I was wondering, I have a question. if you know where chickens come from.
Oh, the old mystery of the chicken and the egg, eh?
No.
Oh.
Where we all know pronghorn antelope come from the west of America. I was just wondering if you know where chickens come from.
Oh, chickens. Oh, what part of the world you mean?
Right.
Yes, I believe the first example of chickens is in eastern Turkey, which is not a surprise because if this is where the ark landed, the surviving representative animal life would, of course, be familiar to the people there.
Jonathan, chickens come from the jungles of Southeast Asia, where there still are.
And they're still there. Yes, that's true. But that's where they are today, and there are also fossils of them over there as well.
George, I'd like to address you for a moment.
Sure.
Every time you've asked your guest how old man is, how old the Earth is, he's sidestepped and obfuscated and droned on about how the geological record is wrong. So what he's saying is it's not old. It's 6,000 years old.
No, I don't think he would say that, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, Jonathan.
Well, go ahead, questioner.
Yeah, I mean, are you a believer in the 6,000? No, you can't be.
I'm a believer that our millions of years theory is totally wrong because the evidence is the strata was laid down rapidly, not from a whole series of ages, but from a particularly key event, catastrophically.
So you do believe we're only 6,000 years old?
I believe that the evidence does not show anything that we're much older.
Huh. Well, I thought earlier you said that mankind could be millions of years old.
He's in the strata that evolutionists say is hundreds of millions of years. That's correct. But man is in all that strata, so he could not have arose. If the evidence goes for us, he could not have suddenly appeared in the last form of strata like we're told by the evolution theory, because he's found buried in all of these strata, which I believe the evidence is now showing were all laid down pretty much at the same time.
Let's go to Victoria, British Columbia on the international line. Hey, David.
Oh, great. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask Jonathan if he had heard of this young woman. There's a grad student at University of Victoria. It was all over the papers locally. I don't know if this got any play internationally. Her name's Genevieve von Petzinger. Anyway, she has come up with 26 letters from cave paintings that they are acquiescing that her research shows that there was a language that was in use for 20,000 years, that she's pulled the language out of these French cave paintings. That people were, beautiful picture, but they didn't notice all these little symbols around, and she used computers to organize these symbols found throughout these cave paintings for 20,000 years, and it turns out it's a language.
Well, I would go along with the fact that the lettering corresponds with our other discoveries that the cave people had a sophisticated beginning and not a primitive one.
Next up, we'll take a couple more calls, and then that is it. DJ in Syracuse, New York. Go ahead, DJ.
Yes, good evening.
Hey.
Great honor to speak to you, Mr. Gray. I believe men like you and Cremo and Hancock are spot on, and I encourage you. I wish you'd address really the issue, the broader issue, the battle between science and the sacred, and that is essential. And Jung was onto it, and Tolstoy, great thinkers, were onto it ever since the Enlightenment, and that's what you represent, sir. And Heinrich Schliemann, a great man, a forgotten man in your field.
Well, there you go, Jonathan.
Thank you for your kind words. I believe that science, so falsely so-called today, there's a science we're being taught which is posing as true science, but it's not science based upon evidence, but upon philosophy.
Next up, we go to Bergenfield, New Jersey. Reagan is with us. Hey, Reagan, go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
Thank you for taking my call. I have a quick question. I was watching the Jack Vanapee program. It's a religious program on cable, and he said that at the Bilderberg meeting, in Virginia, they said that they put a mandate out that they want everybody implanted with that microchip by like 2014 or 2017. Have you heard anything about that?
I have not.
No, I haven't specifically.
Okay, well, Jack Vanapee mentioned. I don't know if you've heard of him, Jack Vanapee.
Vanapee? Yeah.
Yeah. All right, that's my question. Thank you, gentlemen. Good night.
Okay, sure thing. Next up, we go to Atlanta, Georgia. Christian, it's your turn. Go ahead.
Hi, George, Mr. Gray.
Hi.
Good morning.
Hello.
I have a quick question about the biblical story about the confusion of the languages and I guess around Samaria. You were talking about a lot of different technology and stuff around the world. I also had, seen things in passing about, like landing strips in South America and the transfer of, Egyptian sciences and architecture and mathematics throughout the world. My question is, at that point in time, do you think the language or something broader between people as far as like a lack of communication from, one part of the world to another may have a huge, play or a start in why a lot of this technology is kind of like gone from, our society or our civilization, or it may have just been like a whole nother stage or age of civilization? Could you kind of explain that?
There's evidence of one language at one time spoken over the world, and we have evidence of this from Australia, from Yemen, from Israel, from the United States, and from China, and that there was an event which quickly dispersed the people who spoke this language. Apparently, there were the maps that were drawn in the early times were drawn by people who had a common language globally and mapped the whole world. And then after that, there was a confusion of languages. You
know what fascinates me, Jonathan, about the Bible, for example, in the book of Genesis? The stories in there are all based on some kind of fact. Fascinating.
Yes.
Yes.
As an archaeologist, I can't disagree with you.
Let's see if we can get one more in. Scotty in Washington, west of the Rockies. Just got about 30 seconds for you, Scotty. Go ahead.
Okay, Dr. Gray, I was just wondering if you ever encountered any of those gold artifacts in South America that resembled jet aircraft.
Not personally, but I know they exist. I have pictures of them, and I've corresponded with somebody who has handled them.
And what else can they be, Jonathan, but replicas of aircraft?
They have to be of aircraft, yes. And some have been found in Egypt, some other models as well.
The name of the books, Dead Men's Secrets, The Weapon of the Globalist Fear by Jonathan Gray, his website, beforeus.com. Jonathan, thanks for being on the program. Appreciate it.
And a privilege, George.
All right, my friend, you take care. Great archaeologist, great researcher, and just opens up our minds, doesn't he? For Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Stephanie Smith, Ross Mitchell, George Nappy, and Pundit and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie, somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe, everyone.